Today we're painting the king of the clankers, General Grevious. Hello there, and welcome to Zorba Gaming. Today we are diving back into the forces of the Separatists with the mighty leader of the Separatist forces, General Grevious. I absolutely love Grievous. He's an awesome character, and we've got a really fun chance to do some interesting stuff with his paint job. He's got some cool stuff. Obviously, he's got a lot of kind of droidy armor, just like our B1s. We've also got a little bit of that kind of lots of mechanical elements, a bit like the droidicas, but he's got some exciting stuff as well. Obviously, some bloody lightsabers, so we'll be having a look at green and blue saber schemes today, but he's also got that gorgeous cape and a kind of really dynamic pose as well. There's different options on the way that we can assemble him. He can have 2 sabers, 4 sabers, a blaster, lots of exciting stuff. So let's dive into getting General Grevious ready for the tabletop. First up is our assembly. Now, because General Grevious is made with the same hard plastic as the battle droids, he comes on a sprue in a whole lot of components. Now, all of these components are labeled with alphanumeric code so that you can match them up with the instructions. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab some clippers and a scalpel and start taking off the components that we need. Now, the first thing to do is to always build a nice solid working base. So I'm going to clip off all of the leg components and the torso, and we'll glue those together, and then we'll be able to kind of build onto that and build up from that, having a solid working platform. Now, I use a combination of my clippers as well as my scalpel. Sometimes when bits are a little bit too delicate, like the toes of the feet or the lightsaber blades, it's easier to just gently pry those off with the scalpel blade. Sometimes you can accidentally pop them off in a damaging way when you just clip them with clippers, so just take your time and get all the pieces off gently. Once you've got each bit off, you just clean up those sprue joints with a scalpel or a bit of a file until you smooth that scrag away, and all you're left with is a perfect transition between the different detail elements on the piece. To put together the torso and the legs, we have 2 torso pieces which we'll glue together, and then the legs are in 2 pieces each. There is a full leg section and a foot. Now, the feet are a little bit delicate, but once they're kind of glued to the model and then glued on the base, they're totally fine, so just make sure you take a little bit of care when you're prying them off the sprue. We're going to be gluing these models together with plastic cement. I'm just using my Revel brand here, and the first thing I'm going to do is put a little bit of glue on the ankle and glue on each foot. Now, make sure you do glue these the right way around. You'll notice that for a little while here I had one of the feet backwards. Just match it up against the picture and you'll be fine. A little bit of glue in the center of the 2 torso pieces will quite easily join those together. Make sure you don't put too much glue or it will spill out the sides and damage all of that lovely mechanical detail on Grievous's torso. And while we've got the torso, we can throw a couple of little dollops of glue on the hip joints and attach our legs straight onto those ball joints. Now, these ball joints are really fantastic because they make Grievous quite poseable, and you can move those legs around and pick a cool dynamic pose for him. But the trick is, when you're lining them up, is to make sure you're doing it up against a flat surface so that his feet are going to kind of be nice and stable, unless you're doing something crazy like making him run. So once you've got that glue sort of cooked off, make sure that it fits appropriately on the base. And of course, we could just glue this down, but as we all know, I love to pin my models, particularly for Star Wars Legion, because these glue and these plastics, they just don't hold enough. They need a little bit of mechanical bonding. So I'm going to grab some 1mm brass rod, drill a hole right up inside one foot, just going through that central ankle joint that the foot slips over, right up into the foot, and then drilling a hole in the base and gluing that down with some cyanoacrylate super glue to bond the plastic and the brass all together. And then we have a really solid working platform. The next thing to do is to choose your loadout for General Grevious. You've got a couple of options here. You can equip him with 4 lightsabers, 2 lightsabers, or a lightsaber and a blaster. Now, the thing to kind of really note here is, depending on what weapons you choose, decides whether or not Grievous gets a cape, because the cape can only be used when he's got 2 lightsabers or a lightsaber and a blaster. If you go for the full 4-saber mode, his cape won't sit on the model because his arms kind of go too high. I mean, you could probably make it work with a little bit of green stuff and a bit of converting if you really wanted it, but off the sprue, that's how it's intended to work. So what we're going to do is go for the 2 lightsaber variant, because I want that super awesome cape. So we're just going to take off the cape components and my 2 lightsaber arms. You'll notice that the lightsaber arms for the 2 lightsaber versus the 4 lightsaber configuration are actually completely different pieces, because obviously his arm hasn't split in half to kind of reveal the extra sabers, so it's a much kind of thicker set arm, which looks really fantastic. The next thing we want to do is glue down our tiny little neck piece. Make sure you get this in the right orientation or the cape won't sit and Grievous's head will look very funny indeed, and that's just a nice flat join with a little bit of plastic glue. Then we're going to put the two halves of our cape together. Now it's important when you are applying this join that you don't put too much glue, otherwise it can kind of really ruin all of the detail, particularly that check pattern on the inside of the cape. So as you glue these pieces together, it's best to kind of press the inner join and then roll it together so any excess glue goes to the outside, which is much easier to clean up. Make sure you get it kind of really perfectly straight as well, otherwise that blend between the two halves will be quite obvious. Before we glue on the arms, we of course have to glue on a couple of little shoulder plates. Now these plates just go straight onto each arm piece in the shoulder, and there's a little matching groove that's not quite a perfect rectangle with a missing corner, so you'll know exactly which way it glues on, but just have a look at the instructions and a finished picture for reference. And then once again, we've got a couple of ball joints that allow us for some great flexibility and positioning for Grievous's arms. So I'm going to throw a little bit of glue on each of these ball joints and glue my arms down. Now because we're working with plastic cement, it doesn't cook off straight away, which is really great because it means we can glue the arms on and then throw the cape down and pick the arms in a position that's not going to be too obscured by the cape, because it does sort of limit their, ability to kind of be raised up above the shoulder or anything, because the big thick cape fabric gets in the way. So pick a nice dynamic pose that you're happy with and make sure that it's going to fit with the cape on top, and then General Grevious is almost finished being assembled. But of course we have one very important component left, which is of course his head. Now his head comes in two pieces, which need to be quite carefully taken off the sprue because you don't want to lose any of that damage, and then sort of file down those joins. Just be really careful when you're filing this. Obviously this is our hero's face, so we don't want to be ruining any of that detail, but by the same token we don't want any gross mold lines. So just a little dollop of plastic cement just onto the larger piece, and you can drop his faceplate straight on and that will glue together quite nicely. Now I'm going to keep these three components completely separate and paint them all in a sub-assembly just so it's nice and easy to get to all of the different details, particularly the inside of that cloak. So just like our B1 battle droids, I'm going to give these models a nice prime in the WRAITHBONE contrast primer, because we've got a lot of contrast paints that are going to be used with this guy, particularly our bony droid scheme. But the first thing we're going to put down is some Citadel metallic lead belcher. Now this is a very tricky layer, probably the hardest layer in all of the paint job, not because it's sort of technically difficult, but it's kind of difficult where to know to put the paint. There's so many kind of bits of kind of mechanical elements and servos and armor plates all over Grievous. So what I did was I grabbed a reference picture and I sort of made some judgment calls on what I wanted to be that bone armor plating and what I wanted to be silver underneath. There's some really obvious armor plates on the torso and the shoulders, but kind of knowing the exact plating components on the arms and some of the shins and the knees and the thighs can be quite tricky. So what you want to do here is paint all of the mechanical elements underneath those armor plates, particularly on the back of the legs, up in and around the main area of the torso underneath the armor plates, and you can get some really cool effects. Just make sure that you don't get any of this silver paint on those sections that are going to be bone armor plating, otherwise we'll have to re-prime it, because of course we need to preserve that prime for our contrast paint later on. There's a couple of tricky bits, particularly going up the inside of the shin, so make sure you use a fine detail brush where appropriate and just take your time and you'll have a lovely metallic layer to work from. There's also a little bit of lead belcher to go down on Grievous's face. There's kind of a metallic servo component underneath his main faceplate, so just get a little bit of silver in there, and the main place you're going to see that is the join between, I guess, his kind of ear things and his main faceplate. So now it's time to tackle our bone armor plating, and as always we are going to dive straight into Skeleton Horde, my favorite contrast paint of them all. This is a gorgeous contrast paint, just like all of our other droid armor and even our Jedi robes on Obi-Wan. It's incredibly versatile, and you can just slather this on all over the remaining bone parts that are going to be armor plated. Make sure you get a nice even coverage, and the really great thing about Skeleton Horde is it doesn't overpull too much, and even when it does, you can fix it so easily at the dry brushing stage, and it just creates a lovely graduation of color. So really allow that Skeleton Horde to flow into all of those beautiful recesses on the armor plating as well as the flat areas, and once you've got that paint down, don't mess about with it too much. Let the contrast agents do their kind of distilling of pigment and separation, and you'll get some really nice gradients across the bone armor. Make sure you also apply some skeleton horde to the remaining components of Grievous's face. We want a nice even coverage there, and make sure you don't get any crazy pulling across his faceplate, because that's going to be quite a focal point. And there's also a little rim on the inside of his cape that sort of joins at his neck. It's a little bit larger on the top as well, with a bit of a collar, so make sure that gets some skeleton horde as well, but try to keep it off the material of the cape. So while our skeleton horde is drying, we're going to jump into hitting our metallic silver layer with some straight Nuln oil. Now this is to really kind of shade and tone the lead belcher, give it a little bit more depth and contrast, and to really get into those recessed details. But we are going to make it pop a little bit later with some further highlights, so don't be alarmed if you don't feel like this layer is fully done. But what we want to do is just get this on really heavily, so don't be too worried if it goes pretty dark, because we will bring it back up. There's a few really key spots that you want to make sure you get a lovely separation of recessed detail, particularly in his chest plate and the kind of central line, almost like his sternum going up in between his two chest plates on his breast. And you want to make sure that you get all of those beautiful little striations of metallic components underneath with some nice definition from the Nuln oil, and that makes the kind of detail really sing underneath the bone armor. Now once all of those layers have dried, we're going to start jumping into our dry brushing phase, and we're going to jump into Terminatus stone as always for our bone armor. We want to load up a nice old dry brushing brush, take most of the paint off the brush, and then quite heavily overbrush over all of the bone areas. Now this is a really lovely dry paint. You don't have to wick much moisture out of it because it's one of the Citadel dry, and it leaves a really lovely crisp highlight all over the bone toning, and you get a really lovely kind of highlight that makes the whole graduated gradient of the bone of the skeleton horde really sing, and it's just a fantastic result. I really love this armor scheme. Now we're also going to add those highlights to the mechanical elements underneath by coming in with some Stormhost silver, and we're going to sort of kind of more overbrush this really than a traditional dry brushing, semi sort of like a half a highlight really. We're going to load that up on quite a broad flat brush and take a bulk of the paint off, so we're not over depositing too much mithril silver, or Stormhost silver, sorry, it's called nowadays. It used to be mithril. We want to hit all of the top kind of raised sections, all the really pointy sharp edges of the various mechanical servos, and you can do that quite easily just by dragging the brush quickly over various areas in broad flat strokes. There's a couple of really nice angular details on the feet as well, which are sort of looking a little bit one-dimensional before this stage, so you can get some nice kind of highlights into those areas too. Now you might find that mithril silver has just made that whole kind of metal kind of underwire a little bit too bright, so what I did was I waited for my mithril silver to fully dry and then just came and pushed those highlights just back a little bit by applying a little bit of Nuln oil anywhere it was kind of popping too much, and that way you can kind of control the depth of the contrast or how kind of stark you want those highlights to be. Well, I really didn't want the metallic components to be distracting too much from the bone armor, so I just wanted to push them back a little, and then I was really happy with them. So now it's time to start working on Grievous's lightsabers. We've got the bulk layers down, we're trying to do a little bit of detail. Now we're going to jump into another contrast paint here, the Basilicanum Grey. Now make sure you give this a really good shake, because it does tend to separate a little bit in the pot, and then we want to very carefully apply a nice coat all over the hilts of the lightsabers. Obviously we want to make sure we don't get any on Grievous's fingers, because they are basically finished now. It would be annoying to redo those, so just take your time with a fine detail brush, and you'll see that the grey creates a really lovely separation, some nice kind of shaded dark grey areas in the recessed detail, while leaving the top of the saber, the flatter sections, quite a light grey, and that's going to be a really nice basis for creating the kind of gradient of tone that we can then bring up later. Now we're going to jump into tackling our saber blades. Now we're going to be doing the blue blade first, just like we did with Obi-Wan Kenobi, by using some combinations of glazing and highlights with a couple of different blue gradients. Now the first thing we're going to do is grab our Azuman blue, which is a really old school Games Workshop wash. You could easily just use any of the modern contrast blues, or any blue really, and just dilute it quite heavily with Lahmian medium. And I'm going to make a glaze from this wash by diluting it with about 50-50 Lahmian medium in the wash, but you'll want to use more Lahmian if you're using a thicker paint. Now this glaze is essentially like a medium layer that we're putting down all over the saber, and then what we're going to do is come back with some neat Azuman blue and deposit a whole bunch of pigment along different kind of elements of the blade, along the top of the blade, along the bottom of the blade, and what that does is it creates a gradient, a flow of pigment that changes in concentration. So you've got thicker sections at the top and bottom of the blade, and then those lighten off towards the center and then get darker again down the bottom of the blade. And this is just a really simple technique you can do to kind of capture that vibrancy of all of the color crackling and sizzling that would be there for a lightsaber. You'll notice that I had Lahmian medium and Azuman blue wide open, and my cat nearly knocked them over. That was like a true moment of heart attack there, but we saved it. Nothing fell over and I didn't lose any paint, including my massive tub of brand new Lahmian medium. Whew, bullet dodged. So we're gonna leave that for now and let that dry. We'll come back and add a few highlights a bit later on. Now it's time to jump into our green blade, and this blade is a little bit simpler actually. I'm just going to be using the technical paint Hexwraith Flame. Now this paint is essentially a contrast paint that came out before contrast paints existed, and so it has a lovely natural kind of separation of pigment, and we're going to just apply that quite liberally. You can do a couple of layers and it will naturally kind of disperse and create that lovely pigment variation. I also decided that I wanted a little bit more kind of depth of color in my blue saber blade, so once that first layer was dry, I just came back and did another pass of some neat Azuman blue, and then I was really happy with the toning of those colors. Now we'll come back and add those highlights a bit later on, but while those layers are going to perfectly dry, we're going to do the final layer of detail to our mechanical components. And what we're going to do here is add a little bit of oil, a little bit of grime. Here's a big hulking droid and he's fighting on Geonosis, so there'd be bits seizing up and there'd be a little bit of kind of, you know, pneumatic fluid and all those kind of servos. It'd be really gross and oily. So we're going to come in with some typhus corrosion and hit all of the kind of joints, so all of our knee joints, our ball joints, any kind of really over articulated servo areas, and pump a bit of typhus corrosion in there, which is a lovely paint that has a nice kind of gross texture finish. But when it dries, it can be quite stark. So what I like to do is kind of take the edge of that typhus corrosion and just blend it into the metal layer that I'm working into with a little bit of Agrax Earthshade, and that makes it less of a really hard change where you see the texture of the typhus corrosion sort of ending in a really solid line. That sort of blends it quite nicely so it looks like, you know, oil and fluids are leaking in different gradients across the metal. To finish off our lightsaber hilts, we're just going to grab some Stormhost Silver and again do that kind of nice highlight pass over all of the kind of raised areas of the saber. I mean, the sabers are quite bright, right? They've got a really kind of almost a stainless steel sort of look to them, so we want them to have quite a shimmer. So we've got the grey toning under there, but now we want to add that real metallic sparkle by raising all of those kind of edged highlights with some nice Stormhost Silver. Now that our saber blades have fully dried, we're going to come back and add their final highlight with another dry paint, this time the Praxeti White. Now this is quite a fun little process. What you want to do here is make sure you take the bulk of the paint off because you don't want any brush strokes, and you just want to really gradually build up layers and layers and layers of kind of that white dust from the dry brush. You can work with the grain and sort of zigzag back and forth across it, and just kind of create little brighter spots and darker spots by leaving pigment off, and you can get a really cool look that's really simple. All we've effectively done here is chucked a couple of colors down and then dry brushed up to white, and we've got some really decent looking saber blades. So that's the main model of Grievous finished. Now it's time to do our cape. The first thing we're going to do is that inside lining with a lovely wet blending technique with some reds. Now I love using this red technique. I do it on my Rohan in Middle-earth all the time. It looks absolutely killer. The first thing we're going to do is put down some scarlet red. This is quite a thick paint, so you may want to thin that just a little bit with some medium, and you want to get that all over every kind of square, every little check. Make sure you get the edges as well and get a really nice solid coverage that isn't too thick because you don't want to obscure any of those lovely recessed details. Now before that dries, we can dive straight into putting down a wet blended layer of the red gore. Now this red gore just kind of, or gory red, sorry, from Vallejo Game Color. Red gore is the old Games Workshop color. This kind of really lifts and tones that scarlet red and just creates a lot of beautiful vibrancy. Now this is starting to look pretty bright, but don't be alarmed, we will push it back a bit later on. What we're trying to do here is just create a lovely color gradient with these colors, and then we'll tone it back to more muted a bit later on. So we want total coverage all over the red, and then while that's still very wet, I'm going to come in with the Vallejo Game Color Bloody Red and just apply this quite liberally, wet blended to all of the raised areas. So keep it out of the recesses, but don't be afraid to really put it on those top sections and get quite a nice kind of contrasting distinction between the raised sections of the cloak and those recesses. And this just kind of creates that dynamic element. It looks looks like there's light hitting the side of the cloak that's not being caught in the depths of the folds, and it makes those kind of troughs of color look really kind of vibrant and gives you a really nice look to that entire cloak. Now, it's important that we let these layers completely dry once we've done this wet blending. We don't want to mess up any of this blending by applying our wash on wet layers, and as you can see, once it's dry, it's really subtle, but it's got a really nice look to it. Then what we're going to do is come in with some neat Nuln oil and just apply this really liberally over the entire cloak. Now, this kind of has a twofold effect. Obviously, it's working on that recessed detail, so all of a sudden we can see the beautiful check pattern of the fabric, and it just really pops once it's got Nuln oil all over it. But because I'm applying it neat, it also tones it back down and makes the red scheme a lot more muted, which is going to be a lot more suitable to kind of framing the Grievous model and sort of sitting behind him and creating this red halo that's kind of glimmering from underneath his cloak, that's not too eye-catching, but is just sort of a bit menacing and a bit scary, and looks pretty awesome paired against his beautiful bone-stark armor. Now, what we want to do now is glue this cape on, because it's going to be much easier to paint the back side of it when it's glued onto the model. So what I'm going to do is scrape away the paint on the join so that the plastic can bond to itself. Now, where it joins is there's like a flat surface at the back of the neck, and we also want to scrape that away on the underside of the cape on the back of the collar as well. Now, you'll notice here in the video that I used Tamiya plastic glue. I could not get this to hold because it's such a small glue and the cape gets knocked about. So what I ended up doing was switching to cyanoacrylate super glue and also putting a bit of glue on the tops of the shoulder pads where the cape contacts with the model, just so that there were 3 points of contact, and then that cape never came off. So there we can see Grievous is wonderfully glued down and he's got his cape. Now, before we glue the head on, we're going to do the colors of that cape first. And what I'm going to do here is blend some contrast paints. So I'm going to be using the Basilicanum gray and the Ultramarines blue and doing a bit of a 50-50 blend of those two contrast paints. And that's the great thing about contrast paints, is because they're all made in the same way with the same medium, you can mix them and create sort of new variations. And that's what I did here. I wanted to get quite a nice dark blue gray, but as soon as I started putting it on the model, I realized it was way too light. So what I did was I actually grabbed some black Templar and brought that into the mix as well, and I kind of mixed that into a little bit on my palette so that I wasn't bringing straight Templar onto the model, and then I actually kind of wet blended the existing colors I had on the cape with the black Templar, darkened in that mix, and kind of saved the whole cape and brought it back into a range that I really liked. And you'll notice with these really broad flat surfaces, if you've got a contrast paint that's too thin, the contrast is just way too extreme, and I wanted something a little bit more subtle. I ended up still kind of not being super happy with the dried state after one layer. There was too much contrast from the lighter highlights of these big ridges on the cloak, so I just put a second layer down over the top once the first was fully dry, and that's really important. You don't want to be messing up the pigments as they're drying because they look really creepy, but then the second layer down over the top made the cloak look really nice, so it had a lot of depth and a lot of kind of character, but it was really subtle, and I was really happy with those gradients. Then we just want to glue down Grievous's head, because of course we don't need to get access to the cloak underneath anymore, and you can see that Grievous is looking absolutely fantastic. Now, there is one key detail on Grievous himself that we still want to do, and that is of course his eyes. Now, Grievous has these really creepy, menacing eyes that are like half bionic, half organic. They're super creepy. So I wanted to do pay a little bit of attention to them. You don't have to go as crazy as this. I ended up doing like 4 or 5 different colors on them, but what I put down first was a nice layer of brass scorpion. Now, this is a really lovely rusty reddy brass that I wanted to kind of capture that. They sort of look a bit like cat's eyes, and they've got this weird kind of orangey, brassy grossness to them. So I wanted that to be my undertone. So I very carefully, with a fine detail brush, got in and covered the entire pupil with that, just to kind of get that gross organic-y color in there. And then what I did was grab some shining gold or retributor armor in the new Citadel metallic range, and then just applied that in the same way, covering a little bit less of the eye so that there was still a little bit of that brassy red color around the outside, but then we've got a little bit more of that golden vibrance, getting into more of that cat's eye kind of brighter territory, because you do need eyes to often be quite bright, or at least have a point of brightness so that they catch the eye. Once that gold was down, I was really happy with the toning of the eyes, but they still looked a little bit dead to me, so I wanted to create a pop of light, like there was a big light source reflecting in his
pupils, so I just grabbed Stormhost Silver to keep it in the metallic range and created a nice dot of light in the very center of his eye, which created quite a nice focal point, which really makes his eyes read. It's just like creating an eye light if we were shooting film, and it makes his kind of his eyes, they sort of have, you know, they're windows to the soul, right? And they're really captivating now. Now, one final step just to tone it all up and tone that mithril silver back a little bit and get it all grimy and gross is to just hit both eyes and the whole sockets with a nice coat of Agrax Earthshade to get that really gross, grimy look. And this also exaggerates the contrast between the kind of baser layers and gets everything looking really fantastic. So you don't have to go that crazy with your eyes. I just wanted to show you guys a nice, interesting way to get a lot of character in. And the eyes are pretty big as well, so it's very easy to do. So you guys could certainly experiment with lots of little color schemes there. Now, Grievous is looking absolutely awesome, but of course, just like all our models from the core set, we need to get him based in Geonosis. So I'm going to apply Vallejo Game Color Charred Brown all over the base, just to give us a nice working point, and then once that's fully dry, we're going to use my Mars Earth Base Ready mix to create a lovely Geonosis basing scheme. So I'm going to grab some Luke's APS Ready Basing glue and put that all over the kind of flat section of the base. Now this is a little bit tricky with Grievous because he's got his kind of big clawy feet and you don't want to accidentally submerge them in glue, and the glue is pretty viscous. So I just use a little skewer or a paddle pop stick and smush that glue all the way around, forcing it in underneath the joints, although a little bit of kind of glue on his feet isn't too bad because there would be mud flicking up everywhere. I also put a little bit on the hem of his cloak as well. And then once you've got a nice thick coat of that, just dip it down into the Mars Earth Base Ready mixture, and then you've got a beautiful little layer of basing material to start from. Now, because we're going to be painting this, I just decided to leave that for a couple of hours. You can sort of let it go and it's sort of fine in about 15 minutes normally, but if you want to paint it, it's good to let it sort of really cure in 2 to 3 hours because it's a sticky latex glue, then it's got a lovely bond. And then I came back with my dedicated base cleanup brush and brushed off all the excess sand, and you can see we've got some really nice kind of rocks and gravels and patterns there that look beautiful and have a lot of texture. Now, to bring in the Geonosius tones, we're going to grab our Plague Brown as always and just do a nice dry brush across all the gravel to create some lovely mid-tones to get us back into that more orangey brown of the Geonosian scheme. And with Grievous, you can actually do something a little bit different. You don't have to dry brush as much on the stuff at the back of his base under his cape, because of course it would be in shadow, so you can kind of really focus your dry brushing highlights towards the front of his base just to create a nice bit of kind of capture the light of the environment being blocked out by his cape. You also want to dry brush the edge of the rim with the Plague Brown just to bring that brown into the Geonosian scheme. Now the final little layer is to just grab some Bone White from the Vallejo Game Color range and just do a very subtle highlight, just again to capture that beautiful sun kissing the top of the dirt on the Geonosian plains. And this one I would put absolutely no bone at the back of the base, just kind of across the front of the base, because of course that back section would all be blocked by his cloak, so there wouldn't be any highlights from the sun. And there we have an absolutely fantastic little basing scheme and a really awesome Grievous model. I am so happy with how this model turned out. It was sort of a little bit trickier to get my head around how I was going to paint it and what scheme to do, particularly the metallics underneath the bone armor, but I'm super happy with how he turned out. I think he looks really impressive, particularly the sabers as well. My first time doing a green saber, pretty stoked on that, but he's a really, really impressive model, such stature as well, and he just looks fantastic facing down against Obi-Wan and the clones, and I can't wait to get Obi-Wan and stick my lightsaber through him. Quite frankly, it's going to be very satisfying to watch me murder Jacko's General Grevious, but he looks absolutely fantastic.
So there we go, guys, an absolutely stunning model, and I'm super happy with the paint job. What do you guys think of, like, the posing choice? Would you prefer 4 sabers, 2 sabers, saber and the blaster? I think, like, we really wanted the cape, so we kind of went for the trade-off that we still wanted to have as many sabers as possible, so we let go of the blaster. But, I mean, you could certainly kind of swap that back and forth if you wanted to, perhaps, like, setting up a magnetic pin in the shoulder. That could work, but we just sort of committed to the saber idea because we wanted that gorgeous cape. I love the red, kind of, you know, you're looking through his legs and seeing this dark menacing red. It kind of frames him as he's charging towards you, so I think it's a really cool model with the cape. But what do you guys think at home? Do you like the cape? What's your favorite pose for General Grevious? So let us know what you guys think down in the comments below. If you've got any other Legion tutorials you'd love to see, drop them down there as well. Any thoughts or suggestions are always welcome. Make sure you subscribe if you're new around here and check out all of our other Legion content. We've got a stack of tutorials all built around the Clone Wars. A big thanks to FFG for sending that over to us so we could get these these all done for you guys in time. Looks like the Clone Wars is almost upon us, which is super exciting. It'll be really great for you guys at home to be able to get your hands on it finally and paint along with these videos. Make sure you check out the Patreon that we've got down in the description below if you want to support the channel. It's an awesome way to get behind us, and we've got some awesome stuff coming out along with our 10K announcement. So thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time here at Zorbazorb Gaming. Cheers, guys.